Hey everyone, I want to introduce you to a brand new thing we're doing, which is a video blog. I've been kind of toying with the idea for a while, and I've had a lot of encouragement from behind the scenes, because I have a lot of thoughts in relation to designing and yarns and how things fit and how I think about designing and all of that stuff. And up to this point, the two main areas that I chat with you all are either through Instagram Lives, which are a lot of fun, but they're a little bit shorter, they're compressed, the vertical format doesn't suit everything. And also I find that with Instagram Lives, the quality is not fantastic. So if I want to show something in detail, it's quite hard to show it. So there's that whole area that I kind of talk through stuff. And then obviously there is Teachable and the video lessons and things like that I do, which are different again because of the fact that I'm trying to teach or show something very, very specific. And that means that there's kind of less room for chat, less room for kind of back and forth, and they're short and concise and very much to the point, which is what they should be, because when I'm reading or looking at a class or want to learn something, I want it really quick and to the point. I don't want to go through 50 minutes of listening to someone chat when all I want to know is how to do this decrease or that cast on. So it's got a different job. But if you're on here now with the video blog, it's to listen to me kind of ramble on and hear my thoughts and all the rest of it. It's a little bit more fun. And so if there's something you'd like me to talk about, or you're even wondering my thoughts on something in specific, just come on in and ask me, because this is much more casual format. So a good spot to do that is the comments here on YouTube. You can just drop in a comment on maybe something you'd like me to talk about, something you've been curious about up to this point, as to how I do it or what my thoughts are on it. And I definitely don't have opinions on everything, for sure, but there's certain things that I spend a lot of time thinking back and forth about, and it's yeah, it would be fun to talk about them in a little bit more of a casual way. So the very first inaugural video blog, we thought we'd talk about fit and garments and sizing and all that stuff. I've been doing some shorts and reels and trying to very quickly, in less than 60 seconds, talk through it. And it's really tricky because a lot of these little things are a bit more nuanced and there's a lot of stuff going on. And if you want to learn about it in even more detail than what we're talking about here, is I do have a Fit Your Knits course as well. But the video blog here is just me kind of introducing you to it and putting the ideas behind the kind of stuff you might find useful to think about. So we'll kind of get started first of all on figuring out, if you want to knit something for yourself, where do you get started? And how do you make sure that what you knit is going to fit you? So I've kind of been talking about before is there's kind of three things you want to look out for, or not look out for, keep an eye on and know before you get started. The first one is your bust size and your body size overall. Like the bust is the bare minimum. Ideally what you want is the sizing of all of the parts of your body. So you'll measure your bust, measure your shoulder widths, like the tips of your shoulders from side to side, because excuse me, particularly if you're doing something with the set-in shoulders and things like that, if you've got very narrow or very wide shoulders, it can have an impact on how it fits, because what everything else might fit, you could have it with it hanging off the side or pulled in really far here. So shoulder width is fairly useful to know. Then you want to know your waist size and also the lengths to things. So the length from like the top of the shoulder to the underarm, from top of the shoulder to the fullest bust, and from there to your waist as well. So that'll mean that the position, if you've got something with shaping where there's bust shaping, waist shaping and all the rest, they all fall in the right places. Best way to actually get all those measurements done is if you get someone to help you, because when you're doing it yourself, if you're going to go and try and measure around, it's very difficult to get a measuring tape straight. So like if you pull it around like this, you won't realize that the back might be pulling down, and you're going to get a slightly different slightly different measurement than if you're getting the true bust size. So get someone to give you a hand and just hold it around and make sure that it's being held straight. And don't pull it tightly, because you don't want an artificially smaller size, because then it's not going to actually be of any use to you. So you just want to have it so it just reaches across your bust sizes or the different parts. And it is hard to measure yourself, or to measure, to even measure bodies, because bodies aren't pieces of plastic. Like if I go and measure her here, there's no give. It's a hard plastic, or in this case styrofoam. Whereas bodies are squishy. We've got like our parts squish in. It's very easy to slightly change the shape. Your bust size even will vary an awful lot depending on what, on the actual bra you're wearing, your undergarments, and even where your fullest bust point is. So like I've got multiple different bra types, for instance, and each one of those will give me a slightly different variation in my bust size. And there's some of them that I actually won't wear with more fitted cardigans or more fitted tops, because it can add as much as an extra inch to my bust size, and the cardigan just won't fit very well. So you do need to be aware of what you're wearing underneath your knits and things like that. So that's really important. So that's the first thing you want to do, is just measure yourself. Just nothing extra added in, just the actual numbers of your body, because that gives you your starting point. So then the next thing you want to do is, if you've got a particular pattern you want to work from, you want to know the sizings in the pattern. Now in the front of the pattern, you'll have the bare bones information. You'll usually have the finished sizes, and that should be the actual sizes that the garment is. There's no ease, there's no to fit size. It should be, this is the size that the garment will give you when you knit it. So if it says it's 40 inches and you measure across or around, that will actually be 40 inches. If that information isn't in the front of the pattern, which it may not be, because some of them might just give to fit sizes, then what you're going to want to do is jump to the section that gives you the schematic. Take a look at the schematic and look at, the widths, the depths, the shoulder sizes, because the schematic is going to be the actual sizes of what the garment is going to be, all the different places as you are finished, as you're working on the knit. So those are the two starting bits of information. Now what's going to join those together is your gauge. So if you match the pattern gauge, the stitch gauge and the row gauge, then when you knit the size in the pattern, you should get the actual size given on the schematic. So that means that you know that what you knit is going to produce what you want it to. But of course, gauge doesn't always match the pattern, so you may have to do a little bit of modification. If your stitch gauge is correct, for instance, but the row gauge is different, then what you're going to want to do is you have to keep an eye on your lengths and make sure that the lengths match up as you're going through it. That's usually for standard construction. What you're most likely to do is that go for the stitch gauge to be correct, and watch your row measurements or your length measurements as you're going through, because very often people will have one or the other out. But if it's a standard up-down construction, you're better off working with the stitch gauge being correct and then going ahead and modifying the row gauge, because that tends to be a little easier. Obviously, if it's a side-by-side construction, totally different ball game, but that's a different blog post for another day. So row gauge, keep an eye on, but just make sure your lengths are correct. You try and get your stitch gauge correct. So once you've got that, you'll know then that what you're going to measure is going to be the finished sizes. But that still doesn't help you figure out what size you're going to actually wear. Because when I write my patterns, and it's not going to be the same as everyone, I will have two sets of measurements at the front. I'll have the finished sizes, which are as you measure them. This is going to be the size it will be, but I also have two fit measurements. And what that will mean is they'll have the ease written into it with my suggestions. But of course, they're my suggestions and they're what I intended the garment to be worn with. But you, as the knitter and the wearer, may have completely different viewpoints. You may prefer a lot more or a lot less ease than I've suggested in the pattern. And you can change that as you're going through. You just need to make sure that the parts all fit the way you want them to fit. So if something is intended to have a large amount of positive ease, say, you know, one of these really oversized sweaters is meant to have 10 inches of positive ease. As a designer, I will have it so that the body is going to be that big, but the likelihood is I might have the sleeves smaller so that the sleeves will still fit snugly and they'll be the right length and things like that. But if you decide, oh, I don't like that much positive ease, I'm going to size way down to this one that only has a couple of inches of positive ease. If you don't check the other measurements, what can end up happening is you might get the bust size you want, but the sleeves will be way too small. So that's where looking at the schematic and matching it against your body measurements becomes really important, because there's no point having a bust size that fits if everything else is too small or too big. So that's, I suppose, yeah, just where it's more than about the bust. And deciding on your size can actually be as kind of a tricky situation, because in patterns, of course, they're usually written for bust sizes. So they're assuming that somebody with a particular bust size is going to have shoulder measurements that correspond to that bust size, sleeve lengths and upper arm sizes that correspond to that. But of course, none of us fit into a schematic exactly the way it's, you know, the way it's set out by the designer. When I'm writing a pattern, or when any designer is writing a pattern, we have to make assumptions, because it's not physically possible to make it match exactly for every person's size. So what we need to do then is make sure there's enough information so that someone coming in who knows that they're going to vary somewhere along the way, their arms are bigger, shoulders are bigger, smaller than the size in the pattern, they know where they're going to need to make the changes. So that's the best thing I can do as a designer, is to make sure all the information is there, so then you can go and make sure that it's going to fit you and you know where you can make the changes as you work your way along. So then trying to figure out how it fits, that's where the idea of ease comes into it. And it was something that I had never really thought about very much before I started knitting, before I started designing, was how does something fit you? And that's all about ease. If you take a look at, for instance, a t-shirt, very often t-shirts, if you lay them down, are smaller than the size, than your actual body size. So when you put it on, in order for it to fit you, it's going to stretch across your bust size, and then it'll spring in across the waist. So it'll give the illusion perhaps of shaping of the t-shirt when it's actually a straight up down. And that is called negative ease. So if you measure a bust size and say, for instance, when it goes all the way around, it's 40 inches, for instance. Then if you come along and you measure the circumference of a t-shirt or a top that has got negative ease, it's going to be a little smaller than that. So if it's got 2 inches of negative ease, then it would be 40 minus 2, so it would be 38 inches around the chest size of that t-shirt or that top. We don't use negative ease an awful lot in designing of, or in wearing of knitwear, because knitwear, even though it does have a lot of stretch, we're more likely to have it as an outer garment, and it's going to be a little bit looser. However, if you're wearing something that perhaps is a summer top, or it's done in a really loose knit gauge, like very, very fine lace or anything like that, and has like a lot of stretch, you can by all means make it a little bit smaller than your bust size, allow it to stretch across the bust when you put it on, and then it'll spring in at the waist, so it's going to look like it's a shaped top, when in fact it's just a straight up and down. So it's a good way of adding and shaping into a garment that has got none. But we don't use it an awful lot. And whatever you do, don't use it with cardigans, because you'll end up with a little snake effect, because as the cardigan stretches out, it's not going to lie flat. So you have to be really, really careful with that. So that's negative ease. And on the other side, positive ease is where we usually end up with most of our knitwear. So if you've got your bust size, our hypothetical 40-inch bust size, and you want positive ease, say 2 inches of positive ease, then you're going to want to look at the finished size. That would be 40 plus 2, so 42-inch finished bust size. So when you wear it, it's 2 inches bigger as you wear it than your bust size. But you can, I mean, ease is quite personal, and it's like some people use an awful lot of ease and really like something kind of sloppy, oversized, and that works really well, particularly if you keep the sleeves very fitted, because then the whole thing doesn't look oversized, it's just the bust work is oversized. It's really nice for finer gauge fabrics because they'll have a bit of drape, and going oversized works really well. If you've got a very thick fabric, very oversized isn't going to work so nicely because it's going to end up being a little bit more tent-like and stand by itself. So I wouldn't go crazy oversized if you're going to do a looser. If you're going to do a thicker or a stiffer fabric, like with, you know, cables and things like that, it by virtue of the fact that you've got a lot more texture and the stitches crossing over, it just ends up being a lot thicker. And the fabric actually does have an impact on the amount of gauge you want. Not gauge, amount of ease you want, because you don't want to go have too little ease if you've got a thicker fabric, because you really do need and to allow enough extra ease because of the fact that that fabric can stretch as much as stockinette stitch. So be careful with that you've got enough ease to wear. Like most of the time when I'm knitting kind of standard garments, like for this, for instance, or something, I usually aim for anywhere between 1 and 3 inches of positive ease would tend to be my usual extra ease for the garments. The only times that I might go a little bit bigger than that is if, you know, kind of crop style ones. For those, I'll end up with between maybe 5 and 7 inches of ease because it just has a more of a swingy quality to it, so it's a little bit different. So that's how ease fits in, and kind of hopefully it gives you an idea of how you can go along to a pattern and figure out what size do I want to knit and some of the questions you need to ask yourself. So the 3 things, there's measure yourself, take a look at the schematic and what the actual finished sizes are, and then check your gauge so that you can put the 2 of those together, because there's no point knowing your size and the finished size if your gauge is off, because the correlation isn't just going to be there. It's you may know all of the information, but the size that you're going to finish up with won't be matching what's shown on the pattern. So if your gauge is different, you're going to have to do some other modifications to make sure that it all works together. So that's the fit and ease. But as you're going through patterns, you're going to need to make little modifications, because nobody is going to be exactly the way you come out in a pattern. It's not, you know, every person is going to have a few small little tweaks. It might be that you're short or long waisted, so you need to move where the waist is. You're shorter or taller than a pattern, so you need to lengthen or shorten the body. Most usual one is sleeves, people kind of shortening them or lengthening them, or adding or removing decreases and things like that. So those ones are pretty straightforward to do, particularly if you're doing top down. It's in fact the biggest reason I do like top down is because you can actually tweak things all the way along. You can go ahead and you can take a look at the row gauge as you're working, and you can keep checking as you're going, because you can try it on and you can see that, oh, it's getting a little bit too tight or it's a little bit too loose, and you can keep changing it as you're working through. When you do it in pieces, you don't really have that luxury. You can measure, but I may not be the only person who does this. When I'm doing things flat, I'll rarely measure until it's too late. Whereas for whatever reason, when I'm doing it seamlessly, because it's so easy to slip half of it onto a second needle, I will check every couple of days. I'll make sure that I check the sizing of what I'm working on. So it's the biggest reason for seamless for me. I find that I'm much more likely to keep checking the sizing as I'm working through. So the kind of things you might want to modify when you're working along is, this one is curduck, and it is worked from the top down. So it starts off with your saddle shoulders across here, and the width of the saddle is going to correspond to the width of your shoulder from here to here. So if your shoulders are narrower or wider, you can change that width so that it matches up. So you start in the middle and you have half it here and half here, So you just, obviously, you'll take half of the width of your shoulder and match it up so it's half in each size. So that's the first possible change you might make. So if yours was a little narrower, you're going to have less stitches across here. And what that might mean is perhaps when you pick up here, you might initially pick up using a smaller size, or you might just make small little adjustments at the edge. Then if you still want the larger size of the bust, what you'll want to do is, because first of all, you knit straight down here and then you do increases for the armhole here. So when, say for instance, you're going to, your armhole, say you wanted it to be 7 inches deep, then for some sizes, there might be 1 inch of increases working. So you'll work straight until 6 inches, and then you'll have those 1 inch's worth of increases, for instance. If you need more increases because your shoulders are narrower, but you want the bust to be wider, then that's going to take more space. So you'll actually need to start doing those increases a little bit sooner. So if you know you need an extra 4 rows or 6 rows or whatever it might be, then you'll start those increases 4, 6 or however many rows you need sooner. And that will mean that when you reach down here, the armhole depth is going to be the size that you want. So they're the first couple of things you might want to think about. Then when you're working from this point down, this particular one is A-line shaping, so there's increases down here. If you're shorter, you're not going to want it to go as far down, but if you still want the same number of increases, then what you'll do is you'll just move those increases a little bit closer next to each other so they all still fit in, but just in a shorter space, so to speak. So that will be your body from this point down. Across here, when you pick up armhole stitches, this is worked from the top down, and it's a saddle shoulder and then it's short row sleeves. So you use the saddle stitches across here, and then you pick up stitches underneath and you do short rows back and forth to shape the sleeve cap. Now, if you want a larger or a smaller size up here, for this particular type of construction, what you'll do is you'll just pick up more or pick up less stitches, and then you'll do more or less corresponding short rows. So if you've picked up, say, an extra 2 stitches on each side, then you'll add 2 extra short rows on each side so that you've also got a slightly longer sleeve cap that will fit in nicely. So top down sleeves are really, really easy to make little modifications like that in. And then the sleeve is worked from here down. One thing that's kind of interesting with working sleeves from the top down is the stitch gauge often changes. When you're working a small circumference like this, more often than not, your stitch gauge will tighten up quite a bit. So you can do a couple of different things. You can go and say, I'm actually okay with the tighter stitch gauge. I'm just going to perhaps work more stitches. Or alternatively, you can up your stitch size a little bit by moving up a needle size for the sleeves as you're working down. But it's really, really common, and I've had it happen for me and for a lot of other people when they're knitting through patterns. Small circumferences, for whatever reason, more naturally just lend to tighter knitting. It's very common, so keep an eye on it, and if you find your sleeves are getting tight, check the stitch gauge and you may discover that your stitch gauge is a little tighter. So that's just an aside, but it happens very frequently. And then when you're working from here down, you can work to the length that you need. And if you want to make it shorter, then and you want the same amount of decreases, then you start moving those decreases a little closer together. Or if you want it longer, you might decide you're going to move the decreases further apart. So they're kind of all the various different modifications you can make to that style of construction. So that's top down saddle shoulder, but it's really more or less the same as a top down set and sleeve. It just so happens you'd be doing it without the saddle across the top, but all the other parts are going to be the same. There are obviously loads more construction types, but I think that they may be better for another video blog where I can go into each of them a little bit more, because each one has got like slight differences in terms of how you tweak it, because there's other ones here which will be top down raglan, a little different again. This over here is spritz stripes, and that one is fairly straightforward, but it's kind of, because it's a loose gauge, it's oversized, and it's got very open work lacy, so it means that it stretches a lot after you've finished it. It's got its own little quirks that you need to think about as you're working through. But I think I've given you a good starting point today for how you go about figuring out how you'd fit things and how you're going to make the pattern match up with your body size, and just to start getting the cogs rolling on how you'd go about modifying patterns so that they fit you. If there's anything else you would like a little bit more detail in, or you want me to kind of just chat a bit further on in further video blogs, just pop it up underneath there and I will be back here again so I can talk to you about other things that are coming up, and yeah, just a more chill, relaxed way of talking about knitting. I might even pull Laura in here the next day and torture her with having to talk with me on this as well. So thanks for joining me today.